There is something growing inside you right now, and you are almost certainly calling it by the wrong name. You call it confidence. You call it self-respect. You call it knowing your worth. And some of it genuinely is those things, but some of it is something else entirely. Something older. Something that has been destroying people quietly for as long as people have existed. Pride. Not the pride you feel when your child takes their first steps. Not the pride of finishing something hard and knowing you earned it. I am talking about the other kind. The kind that lives just beneath the surface of your personality and convinces you that it is not there. The kind that makes you impossible to correct, impossible to reach, impossible to keep close. Here is what makes this so difficult to talk about. Modern psychology tells you that pride is healthy, that you should cultivate it, protect it, build more of it. And in some ways, that is true. But philosophy spent centuries warning us that pride is one of the most dangerous forces in the human soul. And faith goes even further, calling it not just dangerous, but the root from which every other form of human destruction grows. Three traditions, three radically different readings of the same phenomenon, and the tension between them is not academic. It is personal. Because somewhere in the space between what psychology celebrates and what faith condemns is the version of pride that is quietly shaping your life right now. And the title of this video is not a warning for someone else. It is a warning for you and for me. Because the most dangerous thing about pride is the one thing all three traditions agree on. It never announces itself. It always wears a different face. Modern psychology made a move that would have shocked every philosopher and theologian who came before it. It decided that pride is good for you, and not in a qualified or cautious way. Researchers began distinguishing what they call authentic pride from hubristic pride. And the case for authentic pride is genuinely compelling. People who experience healthy pride after real achievement show higher motivation, greater persistence, stronger self-esteem, better relationships, and a deeper sense of purpose. Authentic pride says I worked hard and it paid off. I grew. I contributed something real, and that feeling becomes fuel for doing it again. Think about someone who finally finishes the project they spent years building, or the person who runs their first marathon after months of training, or the parent watching their child become someone good. That swelling feeling in the chest is not vanity. It is the soul registering that something true and hard and meaningful was accomplished. Psychology says that feelings should be honored, not suppressed. And psychology is right about that. But psychology also identified what happens when pride curdles. Hubristic pride is different in quality. It is not rooted in genuine achievement. It is rooted in a need to feel superior. It does not say, I worked hard and it paid off. It says, I am better than you. And that distinction between pride as self-respect and pride as superiority is where psychology starts to point at something deeper than it can fully explain. Because hubristic pride is not just a personality flaw. Research shows it is linked to narcissism, aggression, fragile self-esteem that collapses under criticism, and a chronic inability to form genuine close relationships. The person driven by hubristic pride builds a life around the approval and admiration of others. And underneath that performance, psychology consistently finds the same thing: insecurity, shame, and a terror of being seen as ordinary. So psychology draws the line between healthy pride and sick pride at the question of whether the pride is rooted in something real, and whether it serves connection or demands superiority. Philosophy, arrived at the problem of pride long before psychology had a name for it. And it arrived there not through therapy or research, but through watching empires fall, watching great men destroy themselves, watching the same pattern repeat across centuries with such consistency that it could not be coincidence. The Greeks called it hubris. And hubris, in the original sense, was not simply arrogance. It was something more specific and more dangerous. It was the act of a human being reaching beyond the limits that defined them as human. It was the moment a person decided that the rules governing ordinary mortals did not apply to them. And the Greeks were so convinced this always ended in destruction that they built it into the structure of their greatest stories. Oedipus does not fall because he is weak. He falls because he is exceptional. And because his exceptionalism convinces him that he can outrun a fate that no human outruns. His pride does not feel like a flaw from the inside. It feels like clarity. It feels like confidence. It feels like the reasonable conclusion of a man who has solved every problem placed before him. That is what made it so devastating. Aristotle looked at pride from a different angle, and what he said is both more nuanced and more unsettling than people expect. Aristotle actually defended what he called megalopsychia, greatness of soul, the quality of a person who knows their own worth accurately and claims it without false modesty. For Aristotle, a great person who pretended to be ordinary was not humble. They were dishonest, and that dishonesty was its own kind of vice. But Aristotle drew a line, and the line was this: the person with genuine greatness of soul measures their worth against reality, against what they have actually done and actually are. The moment a person begins measuring their worth against other people, the moment the internal question shifts from, "Am I living well?" to "Am I better than them?" something has gone wrong, not just morally, structurally. Because a self that depends on comparison to others for its sense of worth has handed control of its own inner life to the people around it. And that person is never actually secure. They are always one, rival away from collapse. The Stoics pushed further. Marcus Aurelius, who had more external reason for pride than almost any human who has ever lived, who commanded the largest empire on earth, returned to the same theme obsessively in his private journals. Journals he never intended anyone to read, which means he was not performing humility. He was genuinely wrestling with something. He wrote about how quickly the great are forgotten, how the men who seemed indispensable became footnotes within a generation, how the approval of others is vapor, how the self that is built on what others think of you is not a self at all. It is a crowd. What the Stoics understood is that pride is not just morally risky, it is practically irrational. Because pride attaches your sense of self to things that are outside your control, your reputation, your achievements, how others see you, and anything outside your control can be taken, which means the proud person is always, without knowing it, in a state of quiet terror, defending something that cannot ultimately be defended. Kant arrived centuries later and named something the Greeks had only gestured at. He called it the tendency to treat yourself as the exception. The person ruled by pride does not actually believe the rules do not apply to anyone. They believe the rules do not apply to them specifically. They will acknowledge in the abstract that everyone makes mistakes, that everyone has blind spots, that no one is above correction. But when correction comes for them personally, something shifts. Suddenly, there are reasons why this situation is different, why the criticism misses something essential, why the person delivering the feedback does not fully understand. Kant saw this as the deepest form of self-deception. Not lying to others, lying to yourself about whether the standards you apply to others apply to you as well. But here is where philosophy reaches its limit. Every philosopher named the problem with precision. The Greeks showed you the pattern. Aristotle mapped the distortion. The Stoics traced what pride costs you internally. Kant exposed the self-deception at its core. And yet, none of them could tell you what to replace it with. They could describe the disease in extraordinary detail, but the prescription was always some version of think more clearly, be more rational, remember your mortality. And for most people, in most moments, that is not enough. Because the problem with pride is not that people do not know it is dangerous. Most people who are destroying their relationships through pride know something is wrong. Most people who cannot accept correction know somewhere that their resistance is costing them. The problem is not information. It is that pride protects something that feels essential, some core sense of worth that a person genuinely does not know how to sustain any other way. And philosophy can tell you the fortress is built on sand, but it cannot give you something solid to stand on instead. That is where the conversation has to go somewhere else. Faith looks at pride and names it differently from both psychology and philosophy. It calls it the first sin. Not the first sin chronologically in every tradition's account, but the first sin logically. The sin from which every other sin proceeds. The Christian tradition in particular has understood pride not as one flaw among many, but as the fundamental disorder of the human soul. The condition in which a creature decides that it does not need the Creator, that it is sufficient unto itself, that it can be the measure of its own worth. Proverbs puts it with a precision that is almost clinical. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. This is not a threat. It is a diagnosis. It is describing what pride structurally does to a person. It blinds them to their actual condition. It makes them incapable of receiving correction. It closes the exact doors that growth requires to be open. And the text in 1 Peter adds a dimension that is genuinely unsettling. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Resist is a strong word. It does not say God is disappointed by the proud, or that God patiently waits for the proud to come around. It says God actively resists them, which means the proud person is not just flawed. They are moving against the current of reality itself. But here is what makes the Christian understanding of pride so different from the philosophical one. Philosophy says pride is dangerous because it leads to a fall, because it makes you vulnerable to the unpredictability of life, because it is based on illusion. Faith says all of that is true, but goes one step further. Pride is the condition in which a person is most blind to their own need, most resistant to help, most closed to transformation. It is not just that the proud person will eventually suffer. It is that the proud person is suffering already, in the specific way that any person suffers when they are cut off from what they most need. And the most devastating observation faith makes about pride is the one the second document captures so vividly. Pride never announces itself. It wears masks. It disguises itself as dignity, as self-respect, as healthy confidence, as simply having standards. And by the time a person recognizes it in themselves, it has usually already done its deepest damage to the relationships they lost, to the corrections they refused, to the grace they were too proud to receive. But faith also introduces something neither psychology nor philosophy fully offers: a way out, not through effort, not through self-discipline alone, but through the specific practice of humility. Not humility as self-deprecation, not humility as thinking poorly of yourself, but humility as accurate seeing. Seeing yourself as you actually are, dependent, fallible, genuinely in need of something beyond what you can generate from inside yourself. And the paradox faith insists on is this: the person who can see themselves that clearly is not diminished by that vision. They are freed by it. So here is where the three traditions converge, and where they most honestly diverge. Psychology is right that there is a healthy form of pride, that self-respect is not vanity, that honoring genuine achievement is not arrogance, that a person who cannot acknowledge what they have earned will struggle to sustain motivation or maintain dignity. This matters, and the traditions that taught people to suppress all pride without distinction produced their own particular damage. Shame-based personalities who could not acknowledge their own worth at all. But psychology risks something serious. It locates the danger of pride only in its excess, in its disconnection from genuine achievement, and by doing so it leaves open a door that philosophy and faith want to close, because even legitimate pride genuinely rooted in real accomplishment, can become the architecture of a self that no longer knows how to receive, how to be corrected, how to need anything. And that self, however impressive it looks from the outside, is profoundly alone. Philosophy sees the structural danger more clearly. It understands that pride built on any external foundation, even genuine achievement, creates a self that must be defended. And a life organized around defending the self is a life spent in reaction rather than in genuine freedom. But philosophy offers correction without comfort. It tells you what pride costs without telling you what replaces it. Faith offers the most radical diagnosis and the most radical remedy. It says pride is not just psychologically risky or philosophically confused. It is the specific condition that separates a person from the grace they most need. And the remedy is not trying harder to be humble. The remedy is the honest encounter with your own insufficiency, which the proud person avoids at all costs, and which the humble person has learned is not destruction, but the beginning of something real. What all three miss when taken alone. Psychology without philosophy produces a person who cultivates pride carefully, but cannot see when it has crossed the line. Philosophy without faith produces a person who understands the danger of pride intellectually, but has no source of worth that does not depend on their own performance. Faith without psychological nuance can produce shame where there should be dignity, condemning the healthy kind of pride along with the destructive kind, and leaving people unable to honor what they have genuinely become. The person who holds all three in tension is rare, but that person is genuinely free. Free to honor real achievement without being owned by it. Free to be corrected without being destroyed. Free to need help without being humiliated by that need. So here is the question worth sitting with after this video ends. Not whether you are proud. You are. Every human being is. But which kind? And more importantly, can you tell the difference from the inside? Because the warning in this title is real. Not because pride will one day catch up with you in some dramatic public collapse, but because the damage pride does is mostly invisible and mostly quiet. It happens in the conversations where you could not hear the correction, in the relationships where you could not admit the wrong, in the moments where grace was being offered and you were too defended to receive it. Those moments do not announce themselves as pride. They announce themselves as dignity, as self-respect, as simply not being willing to be treated poorly. And that is exactly what makes this so difficult. The test is not whether you feel proud. The test is whether you can still be reached. Whether someone who loves you can tell you something hard, and you can actually hear it. Whether you can be wrong without it threatening the foundation of who you are. Whether you can receive grace without needing to have earned it first. Because if you can, then whatever pride you carry is not destroying you. It is simply the soul's honest acknowledgement of what it has become. But if you cannot, if correction feels like attack, if needing help feels like weakness, if being wrong feels like annihilation, then something has gotten inside the house, and it has been there long enough to rearrange the furniture, and you have been calling it by a different name. The good news is that seeing it clearly is already the beginning of the way out. Not through performance, not through self-punishment, but through the specific kind of honesty that humility makes possible. The honesty that says, I am not the measure of all things. I am not sufficient unto myself. I can be wrong. I can need help. And none of that makes me less. It makes you human, which is exactly what you were always meant to be.